This is the time to reignite that spirit of economic cooperation that inspired the creation of the WTO to support reglobalization, to bring greater equality, greater opportunity for many people, many businesses around the world.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Today's episode was recorded live at the World Trade Organization's headquarters in Geneva. The live taping coincided with the WTO's Public Forum, a week-long gathering of civil society at WTO's headquarters. It's a big event. Some 5,000 people registered from around the world and attended a series of meetings, workshops, speeches, panel discussions, and of course our live Global Dispatches taping. The episode features two guests. First up is the WTO's chief economist, Ralph Ossa, who discusses his research on the global implications of widening trade disputes between major powers, i.e. the United States and China. I'm then joined by Anabel Gonzalez, the vice president for countries at the Inter-American Development Bank and a former deputy director general of the World Trade Organization. She offers her ideas on how trade may be harnessed to promote global equality and global prosperity. Now, here is the episode recorded in front of a live audience at the WTO's Public Forum on Thursday, September 12th. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the host of Global Dispatches, which is a long-running independent international affairs podcast. I am thrilled to be here at the WTO Public Forum for a live taping of the show with two fantastic guests. We have Ralph Ossa, the chief economist here at the World Trade Organization, and Anabel Gonzalez, vice president for countries at the Inter-American Development Bank and a former deputy director general right here at the WTO. So our conversation today will be in two parts. First, I talked to Ralph about his research on the implications of fragmentation and decoupling to global prosperity. Then I will bring in Anabel for a solutions-based conversation about how we can avoid some of the pitfalls that Ralph will have presumably described. I am then going to open it up for you in the audience for questions, and we'll wrap up in about 45 minutes on time. Ralph, I wanted to start with you by having you define some terms for us. What do we mean by fragmentation and decoupling?
I mean, these terms, fragmentation, decoupling, I think it's good to be clear about what they mean, or at least more or less clear about what they mean. So fragmentation to me refers to the division of the global economy into competing geopolitical blocks. Decoupling to me would refer to the deliberate process of reducing economic interdependence between two economies. And, maybe it would help illustrate these concepts with some examples. So maybe if I start with decoupling, here the obvious case that everybody has in mind is the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, which at least is showing some signs of moving in that direction. So one thing that we have documented is that since the first wave of tariffs, so since the escalation of trade tensions between these two economies, bilateral trade between China and the United States is going about 30% more slowly than trade between either of these countries and third countries. It's not that, trade is not there anymore. It's not even that it's not necessarily falling over all these time periods. It's just that the trade shares are moving away from that bilateral relationship. So to me, that would be a pair that's moving at least in that decoupling direction. If we think about geoeconomic fragmentation or fragmentation along geopolitical lines, an example of that, or the way we see that in the data, perhaps let me say it like that, is the following. So one thing we've done just to illustrate it in the data is we have looked at voting patterns in the United Nations General Assembly, who tends to vote with the United States, who tends to vote with China, and defined geopolitical blocks based on this data. Of course, you have to be careful with that interpretation. It's really just to illustrate some of the patterns in the data. And then what you see there is that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you see that trade between these two quote-unquote blocks is growing more slowly than trade within these blocks, which we interpret as a first sign of fragmentation, or friendshoring would be, I guess, a similar term you could use.
That's fascinating. So, big picture in the world today, in September 2024, how fragmented are we?
It's hard to put a precise number on this, of course, but the way I always say it is we're seeing first signs of fragmentation. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the global economy is already fragmented. It's not that, multilateral trade isn't working anymore. Of course not. But we're moving in that direction, and I think that's concerning. But one thing to also point out is that trade seems to find a way also to overcome these pressures towards fragmentation. So I mentioned before the tendencies of decoupling between the United States and China, but then what you also see is you see a lot of trade now going, seemingly at least, to third countries. So, for example, Chinese exports to Vietnam have grown a lot, Chinese exports to Mexico have grown a lot, and then Vietnamese and Mexican exports to the United States have grown a lot. So, of course, you can't exactly trace if that's related, but, suggests that it is. So to me, it's really just a time now where I think we will see, and it will also be decided, where we are headed in terms of the global economy. Is it a path of fragmentation, or is it a path of what we call reglobalization, which would be the counterpoint?
Well, so I joke that I'm going to be discussing the doom and gloom scenarios with you and the hopeful, optimistic scenarios with Anabel. So let's get to the doom and gloom, because you've modeled the global economic impact of a world in which trade is fully decoupled between two major blocks, the United States and China, and you've found that it resulted in a 5% decline of global GDP, which is like a mind-boggling amount of money in real dollars. So why would global GDP decline so precipitously under that scenario?
So to me, there's 2 points. Let me maybe say that at the outset. So on the one hand, we have these economic losses that would arise in that worst-case scenario, and I'll talk about that. But then I think what's even more important is that we also need international trade to overcome some of the key broader challenges that we face today as a world and as a society. I'm thinking about maintaining peace and security. I'm thinking about reducing poverty and inequality. I'm thinking even about achieving a sustainable economy. So the monetary price tag, in a way, doesn't quite capture the cost fully, at least. But let's talk about that. So we do find that in the worst case scenario, the real income losses for the world on average would be something like 5%. The IMF has done some work afterwards, also kind of coming up with a similar number. 7% is what they estimate.
And nice to say, I read somewhere that 7% of the global economy is roughly the equivalent of the economies of France and Germany.
Yeah, it's huge.
Just wiped out.
The global economy is big, of course, so 7% or 5% is something big, is of course huge. And what's also important is that it would be even bigger for some developing economies. And the reason is quite simple. First, we all know that there's gains from trade. So then if you disrupt trade, of course, some of these gains are wiped out. And to some extent, these are just gains from specialization. I think it's worth reminding us of that because, people always think of, globalization, fragmentation. These are all such big terms. But at the end of the day, it's quite simple. I think we can all agree that the foundation of our prosperity is the division of labor, right? If I had to produce everything that I consume personally myself, that would clearly not be a good idea. And as soon as I start specializing in something, I don't know, I make the shoes, you make the bread, we need exchange because I want some of the bread, you want some of the shoes. And that's trade. And international trade is just an extension of this across international borders. And I think it stands to reason that it's the foundation of our prosperity. So that's what we call the static gains from trade. But then for developing countries, there's another very important dimension that comes up in our estimations, which is the technology transfer through international trade. So if you're behind the technological frontier, it's just really important for you also to have access to these frontier technology markets. But as I said, I think these are just, quote unquote, the economic costs. I think there's a broader concern how we will actually be able to deal with some of the important societal challenges without trade.
I wanted to ask you about that. In the United States, where I follow the debates most closely, these conversations around decoupling and fragmentation with China are viewed almost exclusively through like a national security or an economic security lens, and there is little attention paid to the implications of decoupling to the rest of the world in general and the developing world and emerging economies in particular. So can you speak to the impact, thus we might know, of a fully decoupled world on emerging economies, on the global south, on lower income countries?
Of course, but I mean, you say that, especially in the United States, but in many other parts of the world, this debate is often framed as a security debate. So let me maybe at least very briefly comment on that. And national security is a difficult topic, so let me leave that out for now. But let's think about economic security, resilient supply chains. I mean, think about the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were supply chain disruptions, clearly. But then very, very quickly, trade became part of the solution. Trade was extremely resilient and was also a source of resilience because, I mean, just remember your own experience. I mean, we all had to work from home. Where did you get all the home office equipment from? Where did you get the personal protective equipment from? Where did you get the vaccines from? And so on and so forth. So trade very quickly became part of the solution. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because if you live in an increasingly volatile world, in a world full of risks, you never know where the supply shocks are going to hit, and you never know who has the capacity to step in. So what you want is outside options, and outside options is exactly what multilateral trade provides you. But then you also spoke about the dangers to inclusiveness. So we just released our World Trade Report earlier this week on trade and inclusiveness, and one of the main findings of the report is that trade has been a powerful driver of inclusiveness in terms of reducing between country inequalities, so in terms of allowing lower income countries to catch up with higher income countries. And the development just over the last 30 years have been absolutely mind-blowing. If you look at lower and middle income countries, they have tripled their income since the foundation of the WTO, substantially narrowed the gap in terms of GDP per capita to high-income countries. And we estimate that about 1/3 of this convergence is due to a reduction in trade costs. So this is, to a large extent, a trade-led economic convergence. This has reduced poverty by literally hundreds of millions of people. I mean, the poverty rate has come down in these countries from something like 40% to 10%. So the fraction of people living in extreme poverty, this has given hope to developing countries around the world that it is possible to escape the poverty trap through international trade. And of course, if you now start fragmenting the world economy, not only is this going to threaten some of the gains that we already achieved, but I think it's also a little bit like pulling up the ladder behind us. And this is really what we absolutely don't want to do.
Is the dynamic that it will threaten the gains because developing countries, lower income countries that have experienced these profound gains that you articulated will just be forced to choose between one of two blocks, and because their options are limited, they'll have less ability to do trade on their terms? Is that like the dynamic in which their GDP might decrease?
I mean, I think that's certainly an important part of the dynamic, and many of these countries don't want to choose. I mean, you hear that all the time. But it's also quite simple. I mean, if you think that trade opening, embracing international trade, embracing open markets is part of the solution, then of course going in the opposite direction becomes part of the problem. So to some extent, it's reversing the gains that we have achieved, but to some extent, it's also really just limiting the opportunities for countries that are still left behind, which, by the way, we also look at the detail in our World Trade Report. There is a fair amount of countries that are still left behind and that still have not benefited quite as much as they could and should from open markets.
Well, Ralph, thank you. We are now going to turn to Anabel Gonzalez, Vice President for Countries at the Inter-American Development Bank and former Deputy Director General of the WTO. So you just heard from Ralph. Big picture, do you agree with the premise of what he's saying, that fragmentation and decoupling is problematic to global prosperity? If so, what do you see are some of the most problematic implications of fragmentation and decoupling?
I do agree with the point that Ralph was making in terms of the concerns about fragmentation. I do agree that the consequences for the global economy are quite dire. This modeling that the WTO has done puts this, I think, the cost of fragmentation into perspective, and it doesn't look good. Now, to me, the one question is, is this something that can we avoid fragmentation? Can the world avoid decoupling? And to me, the answer is yes, mostly. I believe that in a world of geopolitical rivalry, there is the notion that there is no role for trade cooperation because one country's trade gain is another country's trade loss. It's a zero-sum game, right? But I think this view is wrong because protectionism may be aimed at gaining vis-a-vis a competitor or to achieve some short-term national security goal, but it is also inefficient and costly for consumers. And it's costly for individuals, but it's also costly, of course, for firms that relied on imported inputs and the like. So I believe that as long as countries still care about efficiency, and I think countries do, there is a role for trade cooperation, even with geopolitical rivals. It may not be in all areas of the economy, but I do believe there is an important role. And the second point that I want to make related to this is that many countries do not want this fragmentation to happen because they do not want to be in one camp or another because they need to export to the world. And, if you take, for instance, Latin American countries need trade to increase productivity, to diversify their economies. For innovation, this point about access to technology is one that is very critical. And the world also needs Latin America. It needs the food that comes from Latin America, the critical minerals that come from the region. So for this trade to happen, the certainty that is provided by the WTO, by the multilateral trading system, is very important, which is why you see that a lot of countries are trying to defend the WTO because they do care about the system.
Well, let me ask you that because we often think of these big questions of decoupling, obviously through the filter of Chinese interests and American interests, but other countries get a say. Latin America, as you said, is a major trading partner to both China and the United States. How are they able to affect the debate in ways that might reduce some of the negative implications of a more decoupled world? Like, are you seeing actions being taken by trade ministers in Latin American countries to kind of lower the temperature?
I see actions on two fronts. First is actions in terms of economic cooperation, either regionally or globally. And we see these in many parts of the world. Let me take another part of the world now, Africa. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a major effort by African countries, again, to come together and leverage the advantage of trade cooperation. You also see it here in the WTO with a number of developing countries taking leading roles in terms of presenting new initiatives, be it on agriculture, or leading joint statement initiatives, for instance, Chile and Korea on investment facilitation. So you actually see developing countries really taking a very active role here. Something else that I see, and I think it goes to one point that the World Trade Report this year makes, and one which I believe is very important, is that they're also taking actions with domestic policies, because taking advantage of the opportunities of trade requires also putting in place a number of policies and investments domestically, be it in infrastructure, in skills, improving the business environment to attract more investment. So I do see many countries wanting to go in this direction, again, as a way first to protect themselves from some of the things that are happening, but also to make sure that they are in the best conditions to leverage the opportunities.
I just want to emphasize something I think I'm hearing from you, which I find fascinating, is that you're arguing that one way that you have seen emerging economies, not hugely powerful countries, but those that have an interest in maintaining free and open trade, is to turn here to this building, to the WTO, to try to combine their power, increase their leverage in order to avoid and offset some of these other global trends that are happening around decoupling and fragmentation.
Yeah. If you're here in the WTO, you see a lot of developing countries in action. Now, one thing that I want to say is that the view that geopolitics will destroy the system is wrong. But I do believe it is also wrong, the view that says that nothing needs to change, because the WTO needs to adapt to the current circumstances. And I think reforms are beginning to happen. but more needs to be done. And let me highlight a couple of those reforms that I think are important. One is reforms to address trade distorting policies like subsidies that are creating a lot of tension in the world. The WTO has an agreement on subsidies. It has other disciplines as well, but there is a need to revise those rules and even consider whether, special rules may be required to address the specificities of different types of economies, for example. Another area where the WTO needs reform is in the way in which the WTO works to bring about greater flexibility by allowing countries to negotiate plurilateral agreements and then bringing them into the system. I like to make the analogy that, like a tall building, the WTO needs flexible structures to withstand earthquakes and storms, and this is very important. And yet another area where I do believe reform is also needed is in bringing more initiatives that are growth enhancing. Ralph talked about how important trade and the WTO have been for the past 30 years in driving people out of poverty. Well, we need more of that in digital, in green trade, initiatives that focus on inclusivity. And of course, we need to fully reignite a dispute settlement system.
You've discussed a number of elements of potential reforms here at the WTO. I did want to, for listeners who are unaware, you mentioned plurilateral mechanisms. This is as opposed to or perhaps in complement to multilateral systems. What's the comparative advantage to your mind of using plurilateral models, which is, not everyone, but most or groups of countries to advance certain initiatives?
Well, Mark, WTO today has 166 members. Even in the context where we wouldn't have geopolitical rivalry, it's really difficult to get 106 members to agree on everything because there are different interest priorities. So the concept of plurilateral negotiations allows countries that are interested in a particular topic to come together and develop rules in that area. One very important example is on investment facilitation. There are today 127 countries in the WTO out of the 166 that are interested in this topic, came together, reached an agreement. The WTO is still debating how to bring it into the global framework. But the reality is that this is a very large group of countries interested on investment facilitation. There's a large group of countries interested on digital trade. Well, let them all come together, sit, discuss, agree, and very importantly, leave the door open for when others are ready or interested and want to join in.
So you've referenced the World Trade Report a few times. The big World Trade Report from last year was around reglobalization. Big picture, do you buy into this concept of reglobalization, which I take to mean doing globalization better, but not in a way that was done in the 1990s? How do you define reglobalization, and what are the ways to make reglobalization a reality?
So I'd like to go back to the creation of the WTO. At that time, Peter Sutherland, the first WTO Director General, used the word opportunity to describe the creation of the framework of rules that would govern trading goods and services that were being established. He talked about opportunity for economic growth, for supporting sustainable development, for global cooperation more broadly. I think if we fast forward to today, reglobalization is about recapturing that notion of opportunity and bringing it to the circumstances today to make sure that it benefits most people, businesses, and countries, leaving none behind. That means tapping into new sources of growth. We haven't talked here today about digitally delivered services, but it's fantastic the growth that we are seeing in digitally delivered services and how many people, the cost of entry are lower, so many people can come in. The way in which trade is changing to tap into this new opportunity so that many more people can come into the benefits of trade.
So I'm not a trade specialist, so I had to ask someone what they meant by digitally delivered services, and they said Spotify.
Yeah, exactly. It's about videos, it's about games, it's about music, it's about books, it's about all this stuff that you can get in your phone or your iPad or whatever, and that, has grown about 8% a year for the past 20 years or so. And it's actually been growing much faster than trading goods and services for a number of years now. And this opens really great opportunities because you don't have to have a store. All the work about market intelligence becomes much easier. So it's really, allows people to just from their home, start doing things.
Oh, trust me, I know. if you're listening to me right now in your earphones, this is a digitally delivered service.
Absolutely right.
So just kind of going back to this question of plurilateral discussions, I have to imagine because of the nature of geopolitics today, say getting an agreement on digitally delivered services might be difficult on the multilateral level, but maybe a little more achievable at the plurilateral level.
Yes, and exactly that is what members here at the WTO are discussing. They are, I believe now it's over around 90 members that are participating in these conversations, and they've come up with a text already, so there's significant progress that has been made. And I also have to say that some of these things are incremental, right? Getting agreement, even if it's among 80 members or 90 members or 140 members, I mean, it's a major endeavor, right? But it is happening in the WTO, and I see greater space for this in the future. I think, for instance, in areas associated between trade and climate change, that's another area where I see maybe countries that are interested in eliminating fossil fuel subsidies can come together, or those that are interested in the circular economy may also come together. So I see significant potential in the future as well.
Looking to the future, are there any indicators or inflection points that will suggest to you whether or not trade is being done in a manner broadly beneficial to sustainable development of people living, particularly in emerging economies?
Well, I think I would want to think about economic convergence, right? Because it's not that economic convergence is only determined by trade, but trade has had really a very important role in promoting economic convergence over the years. Ralph was referring to this in terms of helping to reduce inequality among countries, for example.
Just by convergence, you mean the idea that countries that are, of a certain GDP are of a higher GDP, like inequalities between countries are reducing, correct?
They can catch up and have a quality of life. It's a decent quality of life, like what many people aspire in the world, right? So if you think that, from 1995 onwards, almost 1.5 billion people have come out of poverty in the past 30 years, and the role that trade has played in that regard, that is mind-boggling. I mean, humanity has never seen so many people come out of poverty in such a short term. So, but we still have a lot of people that are poor. We still have, even if we move from 40% of people in extreme poverty in the 1990s to 10% today, that's still 10%, almost 1 billion people in extreme poverty in the world. So we do need more trade, again, to this machinery to continue to work, to bring more people, again, to have a better quality of life.
So, Ralph, I saw you sort of nod vigorously, which podcast listeners can't see, but I can, to some of what Anabel described. What's your reaction to what you heard from her?
What she says makes so much sense. I think one aspect I wanted to elaborate upon a little bit is digitally delivered services, which is still a word I cannot pronounce. Like we need a new word. It's very hard for me to say. I don't know why. But it is, things like this podcast, it is things like Spotify, but it is much more. I mean, imagine in the United States today about, I think 25% of work is done from home. And this is anything that can be done over the internet, over telecommunication lines. And in principle, if you can do it from home, you can also do it from somewhere else. So there's huge potential for the division of labor in that area, and you can think of things like accounting services, you can think of things like legal services, you can think of things like medical services. I mean, I think the potential is limitless, and what's so beautiful about it is that barriers to entry are lower than in many capital-intensive industries. I mean, on the other hand, we also have to caution, of course, that, it's not all rosy because these tend to be industries where market power is large. I think these also tend to be a space where we see a digital divide. So for example, 1 in 3 people in Africa just don't have access to internet. And if you don't have access to internet, of course, you also can export digitally delivered services. But I think that's like such an important development. And that, of course, needs to be supported also with the adequate rules. But, just the software, just the rules are not going to help. You also need the hardware, which is why you need the infrastructure, which is why you really need a combination of trade policies and complementary domestic policies.
Anabel, can I ask you, if indeed, as you discussed earlier, that digitally delivered services are potentially like a new frontier for international cooperation around trade, in your mind, like what would an ideal agreement look like around digitally delivered services?
Before I go there, Mark, I just want to highlight that a lot of this is already happening. So you have countries like India, like the Philippines, like Ghana, like my own country, Costa Rica, for which digitally delivered services represent over 20% of total exports of goods and services. So, these are countries where Ralph was referring to. It can be accounting, it can be other types of financial services, it can be marketing. And even, beyond that, when you think about digital delivered services, research, there are many things that can actually happen and are happening today. Now, what is important, I think, from the perspective of leveraging this opportunity is to avoid the global fragmentation in the digital realm, because we don't want in the digital realm, to see some of the things that we may be seeing in the world of trading goods. And this is why an agreement in the WTO is important. Now, there are things that can be done to facilitate digital trade, for example, things like payments. These are very important, or things like electronic signatures. They're very important as well. Everything that relates to reducing red tape is also very relevant. There are much more complex issues, which are the subject of great debate in trade agreements, related to topics like data localization, whether you need to have servers in your own country to be able, to have the data there, or whether, you establish exceptions for that. So those are issues that are very contentious. And like with every trade negotiation, the devil is in the details. But I think the objective is clear, which is avoiding fragmentation in the digital world.
Again, just on this question of digitally delivered services and a potential agreement around it, where do things stand today in terms of how these negotiations are proceeding? Or are they proceeding? Or is this just an idea that's floating in the ether?
Well, WTO members have been negotiating in the area of digital trade for a while now. And they just recently agreed on what they call a stabilized text. The WTO has a lot of jargon to refer to different sort of stages of the negotiation.
I'm learning. Okay. I've been here a few days.
Okay. No, I see that you become already quite an expert. So they produced this stabilized text that basically encompasses provisions in a number of the areas that I've been mentioning. But I think that, leaving for the future, some of these issues that require greater discussion among members, such as the one on data localization that I was mentioning.
Ralph, any kind of concluding thoughts, any final thoughts?
I very much agree with Anabel's point about digital fragmentation, the risk. In fact, we have a study coming out soon where we quantify that risk to some extent, and it's also substantial. If my memory serves me correctly, it's also more than 1% of GDP, the potential risk of fragmentation in that space. So that's really important. But there are thorny issues. I mean, if you start thinking about it, very simple things, is it a good, is it a service? I mean, simple things like that are not clear anymore. Right? A book is a book, but then if it's an e-book, what is that? Or a car is a car, but then if you update the software of the car over the internet, what is that now, a car, or is that a service? So, I mean, and these are fundamental questions, because does it mean that our general agreement on tariffs and trade apply, or does it mean that our general agreement on trade and services applies? I mean, this is something that members have to grapple with.
Anabel, I'll give you the last thought here.
This is the time to reignite that spirit of economic cooperation that inspired the creation of the WTO, to support reglobalization, to bring greater equality, greater opportunity for many people, many businesses around the world. I think it's feasible. I think it's in the interest of countries to do so, but the WTO must be reformed to adapt to the current circumstance.
Anabel Gonzalez, Ralph Ossa, thank you so much for your time. A huge thank you to the team at the Public Forum, in particular, Orly and Javier. Thank you so much for your support in putting this episode out and for this great gathering. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.